Okay, looks like the number of attendees has stabilized, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to this set of talks on research and advocacy and the environmental justice movement. My name is Andrew Jewett, and I've had the great pleasure this year of serving as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership in the Hobby School of Public Affairs here at the University of Houston. The Rockwell Center is also sponsoring this conversation today, for which I'm very grateful. We have a remarkable group of speakers to hear from. Each of them has done pioneering scholarly work on environmental justice over the years. So I've asked them to reflect on that scholarship and their engagement with the push for environmental justice as it developed into a wide-ranging social movement from the 1980s onward. I gave them three guiding themes to consider: how they interacted with movement activists, how they thought of their scholarly work in relation to the movement, and who they saw as the audiences for their work. So the event will involve two sessions. The first will run from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock Central. Then we'll have a 15-minute break, followed by the second session from 3:15 to 4:15 Central. We also have two moderators, both from the robust community of scholars working here at UH on pressing questions about environment and energy. For each session, I'll introduce the moderator, who will then introduce each speaker in turn, followed by their comments. And then during the second part of each session, the speakers can engage with one another, and we will also take questions from the audience. You can type in those questions during the presentations as they occur to you, or you can wait until the speakers have finished. Just one technical note: you'll need to use the Q&A button to enter questions, as the chat function is disabled. Now, let me introduce the moderator for session one, featuring the first three speakers: Gerald Torres, Paul Mohai, and Daniel Faber. Our moderator is Josiah Rector. He's an assistant professor of history here at the University of Houston. His work focuses on 20th century US urban history, environmental history, and the environmental justice movement. His first book is out just this month, very exciting, with the University of North Carolina Press. It's part of its Justice, Power, and Politics series, and it's called Toxic Debt: An Environmental Justice History of Detroit. In its earlier iteration, the project received the Michael Katz Award for Best Dissertation in Urban History from the Urban History Association. Professor Rector has also published in the Journal of American History and Modern American History along the way. He's done a lot of work in public history as well. So Professor Rector, we're very, very glad to have you here.
Thanks, Andy. So very excited to introduce speakers for this panel. So our first speaker is Gerald Torres. Professor Torres is professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of the Environment and professor at the Yale Law School. He is former president of the Association of American Law Schools and has taught at Stanford Law School and at Harvard Law School, where he served as the Oneida Nation visiting professor of law. Professor Torres served as counsel to the Attorney General on environmental matters and Indian affairs at the U.S. Department of Justice. Professor Torres has also served on the board of the Environmental Law Institute, the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and the National Petroleum Council. He's board chair of Earth Day Network and founding chairman of the Advancement Project, the leading civil rights advocacy organization in the country. He's a trustee of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Professor Torres has just been appointed to the Advisory Council of the Connecticut Sea Grant. He has served as a consultant to the United Nations on environmental matters and as a life member of the American Law Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Torres.
Thank you. Given the topics that you gave us to think about, I want to talk about a couple of things in kind of historically that I think situate me for this conversation. When I was president of the Association of American Law Schools, I chose as the plenary topic that year the idea of engaged scholarship. And the reason I chose that topic comes from a belief, actually, that our work has to be engaged with the communities that we either arise from or work for, or pivot our work around. And so, we had people who were formative in the environmental movement, in the feminist legal movement, and in the transformation of American foreign relations. So I've been committed to this idea of engaged scholarship right from the beginning. So that's one. Second, when I was asked to take the pen in drafting the executive order on environmental justice in the Clinton administration, the way I did that was by first identifying and then inviting as many environmental justice groups into the Department of Justice to talk to me about the work they're doing. So I wanted to listen to the work the local environmental justice groups were doing, and then to use the insights that I could get from them as they told me about what they needed and how they viewed the work they did to craft the executive order. The executive order, of course, is being changed under the Biden administration, which is proof that you grow and you learn from new experiences, new information. The power of the environmental justice movement, I think, is reflected in the fact that the words environmental justice came from the lips of the President of the United States when he announced his Justice 40, his 30-30 program. And what it has also done in many ways is it's centered justice and equity in the evolving policies. So the work I've done, in addition to the specific work on environmental justice, is work on social movements. And the question I've asked is, how do social movements produce durable legal change? We know how legal change is normally created. The premise of the book is that it is by changing kind of background normative standards through concerted political action that certain ideas which were formerly out of bounds or considered outre or otherwise not viable suddenly make more sense and become more viable. Now, I recognize there's no necessary political valence to that movement, and it can go right or left, and we're seeing some of that today. But the environmental justice movement stands as a testament to the power of social movements to affect not just rule changes in law, but the cultural changes that are necessary to make those rules substantial and to actually have bite. So from the beginning, I've been connected to environmental justice groups. It's funny, my first meeting, and I apologize for dating myself, on the environmental justice movement was in 1978. So some of you I know weren't born then, but some of you were. And there, people were talking about environmental racism. They were talking about environmental justice. They were talking about the confluence of those two ideas and how they work together and how they are used to identify both specific concrete problems, but more importantly, how they constrain or help define the remedies to the problems that they identify. And it's the process, that iterative process by people on the ground doing the work in those communities that permit people who then have the luxury, as all of us do, to sit back and to think deeply about the work they're doing, to try to figure out exactly what binds these movements together and what's the trajectory of the movement that's just both politically, but also analytically. What questions need to be examined? And when you think of it from the perspective of the scholar, in some ways, that's a critical question. That's a critical question because you're not just documenting what happens, you're actually trying to understand the questions that are being asked and how can they be formulated in a way that allow further research. And I'm a lawyer, so basically I don't have the disciplines of the other panelists, but I can turn to them, and I can turn to sociologists, I can turn to geographers, I can turn to green scientists, green chemists, and I can say, or industrial ecologists, and I can say, look, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm thinking. Help me think about this where's the data that is going to help me, if I'm going to be involved in litigation, make the proof, right? How can I take my hunch and make it real? And so the work with groups on the ground has been, to me, absolutely critical. The goals of the movement is defined by the movement. I don't want to speak for my other panelists, right? I give it some shape within law, but the goals come from the people themselves. And I think that's critical to recognize. What's also important is the movement, which in many ways started, the nomenclature anyway, started domestically, now has international and global reach. So the environmental justice movement isn't just a domestic movement, it has a global reach. It's now, forcing us to rethink things like refugees and whether climate refugees is a category that ought to be legally protected because of the actions that we failed to take that has in fact generated that kind of burden. It reminds us, the environmental justice reminds us, as the saying goes, you never throw anything away because there is no way, right? It's always going somewhere. And you have an obligation to the place it's going, as well as the reduction of waste domestically. So the international growth, I think, has been important. And because I do international work, I view my reach primarily in Latin America, but my outreach to Latin America to be critical to my understanding of how issues are evolving. Finally, who's the audience I address with my work? I had the tremendous good fortune of being able to study with Joe Sachs there at the University of Michigan years ago. And Joe told me a couple of things. He said, look, you've got to write stuff for your discipline, and you've got to write it within the contours that the discipline requires. But then you've got to write to people who aren't in your discipline. You've got to write to people who aren't in the academy. You've got to write so that you reach the broadest audience you possibly could reach. And I've taken that to heart. So I view the audience for my work as people who are in the environmental justice movement, people who are in the environmental justice field. So when I teach environmental justice and climate justice, and my students are reading geographers, they're reading sociologists, they're reading demographers, they're reading people across the disciplines. And what I want them to do is to take the insights from those disciplines, ask how it informs the work they're doing, and then do the work. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks very much for that, Professor Torres. 1 second. Sorry, I have a noise in the background. Apologize. Our next speaker is Paul Mohai. Paul Mohai is a professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. In 1990, he co-organized with Professor Bunyan Bryant the Michigan Conference on Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards, which was credited by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency as one of 2 events to bring environmental racism and injustice to the attention of the agency. He is a co-founder of the Environmental Justice Program at Michigan and a major contributor to the growing body of research examining disproportionate environmental burdens and their impacts on low-income and people of color communities. He has served on the US EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, and has provided testimony on environmental justice to the US House of Representatives, the US Senate, and the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. He is author of numerous articles, books, and reports focused on race and the environment, including Environmental Racism, Reviewing the Evidence, Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards, Toxic Waste and Race at 20, and Which Came First, People or Pollution. So I'm very pleased to pass it over to Professor Mohai.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm very pleased to be here and thank the organizers for inviting me to this event. I wanted to start out by explaining how I got involved in this issue. In some of the questions I had read, it sounded a little bit more deliberate than I think what really happened to me. I see my involvement as more having evolved. When I got interested in this issue, it was not yet a field of study, and the environmental justice movement was, I think, just gaining some visibility. So I wanted to start off by talking about the two things that influenced me the most, at least right at the very beginning. One was my colleague, Professor Bunyan Bryant, who's now retired. He's about to come out with his memoirs, and I've already read it, and it's a fascinating book. The other major influence on me was toxic waste and race in the United States, and I want to explain just for a couple of minutes how this all came together. First of all, I started my assistant professorship at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability in July of 1987. And when I came, I had already begun analyzing a very large and comprehensive national survey of environmental attitudes. And I realized that this survey was so big, over 7,000 people were interviewed, which makes it the largest environmental survey ever done then and since, because as you probably know, most national surveys are about what, 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,500 people. This was over 7,000. And I just knew that given how big the survey was, there was going to be a lot of African Americans in it, and there were. And at that point in time, this was, like I say, around 1987, almost nothing had been written about the environmental attitudes of African Americans and people of color. And because so little had been written, even though I knew I had a great data set, I didn't really have much literature to draw on to create the context and literature review. However, when I came to Michigan in July of 1987, I met my colleague, Professor Bunyan Bryant, and he was literally the first African-American environmental studies professor I ever met. And I figured, well, he's African-American, he's here at a school for environment, maybe he could give me some tips. So I arranged an appointment with him and met him, and he was very polite and very helpful. I explained to him what I was trying to do with the project. And he had pointed me to what I would say was a relatively small number of publications, which back then wasn't surprising. Maybe it was eight articles and reports. And I found them all interesting and useful, but the report that really caught my attention was Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, which had only come out a couple of months before that. It was published in March of 1987. And I have to say that reading that report was a real game changer, a life changer for me. If you all remember, and I think most of you are, I remember Professor Torres was talking about how who's the youngest here, who's the oldest. I suspect, looking around the screen, we all were around in the 70s and 80s. But if you'll recall back then, we tended to talk about environmental problems as problems that affect us all, and by implication, therefore, they affect us all equally. And so when I read Toxic Waste and Race, it was providing a much different picture. I had never stopped to think until that point in time whether environmental burdens were more concentrated or more of a problem on certain groups in society. And when I read that report, and for those who are listening and are not familiar with that report, it was a national study, and it was the first study to look at the distribution of hazardous waste sites, and it found that communities that had hazardous waste facilities in them were communities that had disproportionate concentration of people of color in them. And then when it went on to do a multivariate statistical analysis to look at what best predicts where these sites are located, They not only looked at the people of color percentages in the communities, but also the income levels, property values, and other things. And they found that race was the best predictor. So, as I said, that really changed my life. I mean, the driving question for me at that point was, are there other studies like it? And do they point in the same direction? And this was back in the late 80s. And I suspect everybody in the webinar whose faces I can see, I know that back in late 80s, library computer catalogs were not yet digitized. We didn't have the internet. I think we did have email, but I'm not sure we could send attachments back then. Anyway, I'm saying that all this because it was a real challenge trying to look for these articles. But back in those days, the University of Michigan had information specialists. You tell them what you were looking for, and they would try to find it for you. It was a long process because every week I'd come back. They didn't have that much, but one of the things I started to discover was that two names kept popping up over and over again, and that was Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright. And they were calling out the environmental racism and injustice before they preceded toxic waste and race. So to me, that was very significant. And when I realized I had kind of cornered or pretty much found everything I was going to find, I realized I had no other option but to try to call them and talk to them. And as with Professor Bryant, they were very helpful. They were very cordial and eager to help me. And so in the end, Professor Bryant and I, because at that point we started working together, we found about 15 studies. So, which is, now if you go to Google Scholar and you put environmental justice into a title, you'll draw down at least 10,000 titles. But back then, all we could find was about 15. So anyway, Professor Bryant and I really, because we were both so interested, I don't know what we're committed, interested. We had a chemistry, we just became a very close colleagues, and we started a number of projects, and I won't go into all of them, but one of the ideas that we had conceived of was to organize this conference. What we were trying to do was find everybody in the country that we could find who was, and we were initially started out with academics, who were doing research and writing about this topic. And of course, Dr. Bullard and Dr. Wright were among those. Charles Lee, who's the lead author in Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, we talked to him and invited him. I began to think about divine invention because out of nowhere, out of clear blue, I get a call. And again, these are the days before answering machines. So I just happened to be sitting at my desk at the right time when I got the call. And the person that called me, her name was Dorceta Taylor, who was working on her PhD at Yale at the time. And I had just published my first paper, and she asked me if she could reproduce a figure I had in it. Of course, I was very flattered that, I had my first publication and there's somebody out there that actually cared. So anyway, of course, when I found out what she was working on, which was writing an article herself on the environmental attitudes of African Americans, she became part of that conference too. And even though Yale has her right now, I just want to make a plug here. She was for a long time here at the University of Michigan as a colleague. So anyway, when Professor Bryant and I were doing this, we knew that there were policy implications to this issue. So we started thinking about inviting people from the federal government and from our state environmental agency. They didn't have to do anything. We just wanted them to be here as observers. And they came, and somewhere along the conference, somebody had the idea, and I don't recall anymore, this was over 30 years ago, who came up with the idea. But somebody said, we should write a letter to the head of the EPA and the head of the CEQ, which is the Council on Environmental Quality, and to the head of or the Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and see if we can get them to pay attention to this issue. And maybe we could see if they will meet with us so we could talk him into developing some policy on the issue. And this again, sometimes unplanned events have amazing consequences. We never anticipated the huge impact that would have. We did want to get the EPA's attention and everybody else's attention, so we had the strategy. Again, we didn't have the internet, so we had to make hard copies. And so we must have made hundreds of copies of this letter, but we made sure every member of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, every key member that we could think of in the House of Representatives, every one of the U.S. senators, and every one of all 50 governors around the country. We figure if we carbon copied all those people, they were not addressed on the head. We just addressed the top three that I mentioned: CEQ, EPA, and HUD. Nobody can say they never got the letter. So, my God, it worked. We got invited by both the CEQ and the EPA to meet with their agencies. In fact, EPA had us meet with the head of the EPA, Administrator William Riley, and this was in September 13, 1990. And there were 8 of us representatives from our conference that went there. And I was very struck by how easy it was. I thought he was convinced by us, and I suspect he got convinced more, but I had a suspicion he was already convinced before we got there, because he already had proposals in hand when we met, and he stayed with us for a good hour. The whole meeting itself was 2 hours with his staff, but he was inclined to not only believe it, but he promised that he would meet with us. He called us the Michigan Group or the Michigan Coalition. At the time, there were only 8 of us. It started to grow. There were many more community leaders and activists that started to come to the meetings. But one of the things that the administrator promised was he put together a work group. They called it the Environmental Equity Work Group. And the work group was charged with reviewing the evidence and developing recommendations to address environmental justice. And they worked on this for about 1.5 years. They came out with a report in June of 1992. And it was very heavily criticized by the environmental justice community at the time for not going far enough. But I knew that this was an important report because it was the first document by any agency of the federal government that acknowledged the problem and that something had to be done about it. And it got reported in the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Washington Post, and many other newspapers. And when that report came out, then we started to see hearings in Congress. We started to see bills being introduced in Congress. As Professor Torres mentioned, by 1994, President Clinton issued Executive Order 12898. And so I want to mention too that I don't want to make it sound that what you just heard is all that's happened, but I wanted to explain how I got involved, and because I think that was one of the questions. I want to say another really important event, and I'll yield the floor. That about 1 year later, the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit was convened. Professor Bryant and I were both asked to be on the advisory board, and both of us went to that conference that had almost 1,000 people. And and that's the conference where the 17 principles of environmental justice were generated. And the one memory I won't ever forget is how an African-American man, I don't recall where he was from, he said that, before I came to this conference, I thought what was happening in my community was just happening in my community. And when I hear people talk, I'm hearing the same thing from all these people saying the same thing. And by the way, they all look like me. And for some reason, it just kind of, things came together for me in that, there's a self-awareness about this movement now being a movement. And I think that was very significant turning point. Anyway, I could go on, so I'm going to stop right there. I don't want to take Professor Faber's time. So thank you.
Great. So our final speaker is Daniel Faber. He's professor of sociology at Northeastern University and senior research fellow at the Global Center for Climate Justice. He's also director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative. His research is focused in the areas of political economy and crisis theory, environmental sociology and policy, climate justice, social movements, classical and contemporary social theory, environmental justice, philanthropy, Central American underdevelopment, and globalization. He co-founded and worked as research director for the Environmental Project on Central America at the Earth Island Institute from 1984 to 1990. Professor Faber, has produced several major reports and edited collections in addition to his own books, Environment Under Fire, Imperialism, the Ecological Crisis in Central America in 1993, Capitalizing on Environmental Injustice, the Polluter Industrial Complex in the Age of Globalization in 2008, and his current project, The Ecological Contradictions of American Capitalism Towards a Transformative Environmentalism. Professor Faber.
Thank you so much, Josiah. I just actually ordered your book. Can't wait to read it. And I would also like to thank Andy and all the organizers for inviting me to be part of such a spectacular panel. So not to be a determinist, but I think it was inevitable that I was going to be an environmental justice scholar just by the virtue of my upbringing. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and my dad was one of the leading consultants to school systems all over the country that were attempting to desegregate and promote racial equality. So some of my earliest memories were the death threats that we used to receive as a young child. And so I became politicized at a very young age around the struggle for racial justice, and learned at a very young age, when we see an injustice, we stand up, we speak out, and we take action. And so that was instilled in us in a very strong manner as a child. Later, we moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and I grew up in Kentucky. My older sister went off to law school, and then she became part of Red in Appalachia at the same time I entered college. I used to spend a great deal of time with her, and she was representing poor rural white families in Appalachia that would have their homes wiped out by a landslide caused by a coal mining company engaged in strip mining or mountaintop removal, doing it improperly. And so she was there taking on the coal companies, and I would spend time with her, travel around, visit people who were living without running water, without electricity, and got to see the paradox of what it was like to see such massive poverty in a region that was producing such enormous wealth in the form of coal. I had the good fortune of studying with Harry Cottle and doing a lot of work at Highlander Center and John Gaventa, and understanding why people would acquiesce in the face of such extreme poverty and oppression at the hands of major corporate polluters. And Harry Cottle was the voice of Appalachia. And at that point, I developed a very Gramscian perspective in terms of a respect for scholarship that's devoted to not understanding the conditions of environmental economic exploitation, but how we can speak to people in a discourse that inspires them to become part of a movement to change these conditions. So at that point, I became determined to be an environmental sociologist, went off to the University of California, Santa Cruz to achieve my PhD. And this was in the early 80s. I'm dating myself now. But this was right on the heels of the popular revolution that overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. And so I traveled to the region and witnessed that the Sandinistas government at that time was creating some of the most far-reaching environmental programs of any country in the global South. In fact, I wrote a book about it called Revolutionary Ecology. And environmental justice, sustainable development, ecological democracy, and national self-determination were all key components of any program that was being implemented in Nicaragua. And also saw the tremendous repression that was exercised throughout the region, particularly in El Salvador, Guatemala. And so we formed the Environmental Project at Central America based at originally Friends of the Earth, later Earth Island Institute, had the pleasure of working with David Brower and many of the leading environmental activists in the country, making the connections between US foreign policy, ecological imperialism, poverty, human rights violations in the region. So originally I was working around racial justice, then the issues of poverty and environmental exploitation of rural white communities. And now our focus was on coalitions that existed among campesino small family farmers, farm workers, and indigenous peoples in Central America in the struggle against ecological imperialism. Received the PhD, was fortunate enough to be offered a job in Boston, and came to Northeastern University and established the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative in 1990, and began working with the leadership of the environmental justice movement around a number of issues of what I considered and what they considered to be strategic importance to the movement, and where my scholarship could really help advance the cause. So one example of that would be a study I did called Green of Another Color, where we ran the numbers and we realized the environmental justice movement was one of the most underfunded social movements in the United States. So I began doing a lot of work in the foundation world, doing interviews and understanding what were the processes and mechanisms by which the foundation world was ignoring the struggles of the environmental justice movement. There were several mainstream environmental organizations that by themselves received more funding than the entire environmental justice movement put together. And so looking at the realm of philanthropy, how can we move the money to the EJ movement? How can we develop a critique of racism? And of course, you mentioned Dorsita Taylor. She's done some really great work in that area as well. How can we combat racism within the world of philanthropy in order to advance the cause of environmental justice in the country as a whole? So over the years, we really developed a lot of analyses that we considered to be of strategic importance to the movement. And over time, I brought what I thought was a fairly synthetic view of environmental justice to my scholarship. And that is, and similar to David's work and others, I take a very intersectional analysis. And for me, that means is how do structures of racial oppression, class exploitation, political domination, and particularly neocolonialism, how do these structures of power intersect and mutually reinforce one another? And so when we started the Global Center for Climate Justice, and we're still in our first year and getting off the ground, but we bring to it what we call an emancipatory climate justice perspective, a very intersectional analysis, to take on the most powerful corporations in the world, particularly the fossil fuel industry, or what I call the polluter industrial complex. We have to build a multiracial, multi-class, multi-generational movement and an international movement as well that has the power necessary to take on these corporations. So an intersectional analysis that can show how these different experiences that are felt by people of color, working class, whites, peoples of the global South, they are realized in different forms, but they are all interrelated into these larger structures of power, particularly corporate power structures in the age of neoliberal corporate-led globalization. Because our analysis is then that if we can develop solidarity across these lines, the movement can become more powerful. And also in our work, not just intersectionality of people, but also the intersectionality of issues. How do different issues also interrelate? Because so much of the legacy of traditional environmental policy is that it often addresses one particular problem, but in a manner which unintentionally makes another problem worse. So we're going to ban DDT to protect wildlife and protect women against breast cancer. But if large agribusiness growers switch to organophosphate chemicals, which are much more toxic, and farm worker poisonings go up, which is exactly what happened in the 70s, you haven't addressed the root causes of the crisis, which is an agricultural system dependent upon toxic chemicals to achieve high yields. So similarly, if you want to promote more just transportation in the city of Boston or San Francisco or Los Angeles, anywhere else, and you build mass transportation systems. But those improvements in access to transportation result in higher property values and higher taxes and higher rents, and result in the economic dislocation of the residents who often lead those very same struggles for transit justice or environmental justice. Then the problem has just been transferred into another form. So at the center, we really bring a environmental justice perspective to our Green New Deal work. And more namely, how can we develop a politics of transformative environmental justice rather than focus on issues of distributive environmental justice? I've always said the goal of the environmental justice movement, not necessarily to ensure that all people are polluted equally. Makes for a terrible bumper sticker. It's not a great organizing symbol, but rather to develop a politics that can address the root causes of ecological crisis, that can address the processes by which these problems are created in the first place and then distributed inequitably, not just in my backyard, but in everyone's backyard. And so in our view, that's what we call an emancipatory climate justice politics. If we can demonstrate to people the way in which embracing an environmental justice struggle can actually make their lives better and create a better future for all of humanity, particularly around climate change, then people will not necessarily retreat in fear from this existential threat, which is climate change, but rather be inspired to be part of a movement because they can visualize the way in which this movement and this politics can create perhaps the best society the world has ever seen. So yes, renewable energy is great, but if you can install renewable energy on your own home and it produces energy to not only heat your own and power your own facility, but gets exported on the grid, so much so that utility sends you a check at the end of the month rather than vice versa, then you've helped to emancipate people from structures of power, particularly corporate power structures, which might be deemed oppressive or exploitive. So we can develop a politics which serves to emancipate people from these larger structures of power and domination, which are racist, which are class exploitive, which are often imperialist in nature. Then we think we can build a truly mass-based movement with the power capable of doing that. So I also sit on the board of Coming Clean, and a lot of pioneers in the EJ movement, such as Richard Moore on the governing board with me. And Coming Clean was put together very much with the same mission, and that is, you probably never heard of us, but that's by design because we work with 300 different organizations behind the scenes to bring them together, make sure they're not working at cross purposes. How can we develop strategies for the movement as a whole? Channel resources to the grassroots, particularly EJ organizations and organizations working in communities of color. But how can we develop a more transformative politics? So example of that would be in Europe, where under REACH, in Europe, the burden is now placed upon capital, on corporations, to prove that their products are safe before they can be introduced into the marketplace. In the United States, the burden is placed upon the public, on us, to prove that a product is dangerous after it's been introduced into the marketplace. So it's a much more precautionary approach. It mandates the phase out of toxic chemicals that we know to be harmful to human health. To me, that's a transformative environmental justice politics that goes to the root causes of the ecological crisis. So I think I'm run out of time, but I think being a scholar and an activist who tries to use theory to advance a particular type of praxis, a more emancipatory, transformative environmental justice politics, and to do so in a way that is in a popular discourse, I think it's almost an obligation at this point on all of us. We have to get our work out from behind the academic paywalls and really make the work as accessible as we can to the larger public. So thank you.
Thanks to all three of the panelists. Jumping off on the point that Dan concluded with about the importance of getting this work out to the public, I was wondering if any of you or all three of you would like to reflect a little bit in our remaining time. We have just over 10 minutes left on your interactions with activists outside of the academies, people based in the university who have decades of experience interacting with activists in the movement. Have you learned any lessons about the right way and the wrong way, for lack of a better term, to interact with activists in these social movements as someone based in the university? Did you make any mistakes along the way that led you to rethink the way that you interact with activists, for example?
Yes, I wanted to address that. I think in some ways, well, there's certainly things, there are what I would call do's and don'ts, but I think the bottom line in terms of working with activists is the importance of developing trust. And there's many times where I've seen people doing the exact opposite of building trust. First of all, a lot of the communities, in all honesty, are suspicious of academics because there has been a history where people have been exploited for data so that researchers can get publications out of it or use that information to write a grant. And oftentimes the communities don't see any benefits to them. And in many cases, there's not even a pretense of providing the community with benefits. So, so I would say certainly if you're coming in to the community with seeing them as a kind of a research opportunity, that's exactly the wrong way to go. The things that I would advise anybody is most important thing is to be respectful, be humble, and listen. Don't tell them what their problems are because they'll resent it. Their reaction will be, how can you tell us what our problems are? You haven't even talked to us to find out from us what we see as the problems. So I think academics, all of us as academics, we strive to be authorities in something, an expert in something. And I think sometimes that goes to our heads in the sense that we may feel we either know everything about a topic, or just because we know everything about a certain topic, we know everything about everything. So certainly the attitude coming in terms of interacting with communities is really important. And I'm trying to think of my own experience, how I developed all the relationships I've had with activists and community leaders. And I would say always look for the opportunities. Again, it's very difficult to say, I'm going to help this community and go in there and be credible or trusted. But look for the opportunities. I gave a presentation at a conference where there were community people there. And after the conference was over, somebody came up to me, a community person, and said, that there's this refinery that wants to expand in our community, and they've done an environmental justice analysis, and they've sent it to the state, but we don't trust it. Would you take a look at it and tell us what you think? So that was, to me, was an example of an opportunity. Someone from the community came to me and asked questions or asked me for help. And so when I read over this analysis, I thought, well, it's, a lot of hand waving, not much else. And I thought, well, rather than me just writing a response, I thought, what if I got a colleague from the School of Public Health and a colleague from the law school, and all three of us wrote a response? I bet that would have an impact, and which we did. And I was very proud of the result, and the community really appreciated it. I mean, in terms of, there was an opportunity for me to develop trust and we helped the community out. I wasn't looking for any kind of payment or how can I turn this into a research grant. The way I looked at it was, for any academic, you have three functions: teaching, research, and service, including external service. And that's the way that I looked at that. It's also helpful to know people that the community trusts. And if you know them and they trust you, an introduction wouldn't hurt from them. But I think it's mainly maintaining a respectful attitude and being a good listener, and assuring people in an honest way you're not there to exploit them. So anyway, that'd be at least part of my answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have officially 7 more minutes, although we can go over just a little bit if folks want to continue. But if anyone wants to answer that, feel free to do so. We do have also an audience question, but Daniel, did you?
Yeah, just very quickly. And, for example, I think every scholar should subscribe to the Hermes principle so you don't end up exploiting the communities that you're offering studying. And I totally agree with Paul on that. And too often that's been a problem in the past. I'm really structural around this. I think we're in a position to use the institutional resources available at universities to really advance the movement. And sometimes we're good at that and sometimes we're bad. So I'd look at this structurally. If we can create entities that are dedicated to servicing the needs of the movement. I created an environmental justice research network that pulled together leading EJ scholars. And the purpose of the network, just to make themselves available to the movement. If they needed help doing a study or co-writing a grant or expert testimony, then later we folded that into knee-jerk. So form your own network of scholars that you can make available through an institutional means, some type of organizational structure to the movement. And then it becomes institutionalized, and then you magnify your capabilities. And so that's what we did with knee-jerk, and that's what we did with Agyeman. And it really proved to be enormously effective. And you're there for a resource, and it's really greatly appreciated. And much of my own research, I had my own research agendas, but very often it ended up being co-opted, if you will, by the needs of the communities that I was interacting with. So, and I was so happy for that. So I think we can use the resources provided by the university to create these institutions.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from, I'm sorry,
no,
Gerald.
I was going to say, I don't have anything to add to what Daniel and Paul said. I think the key word in Paul's discussion, and I think it was echoed in Dan, is respect. That is, you've got to respect the work these folks are doing, right? Because they're doing, in some ways, they're doing the hard work, and they're doing the hard work. And you've got to approach them with respect. As to the answer that's in the Q&A, I think that initially that probably was true. That the position of Indigenous people, certainly in the United States, wasn't at the forefront of a lot of the EJ work, but as Paul or Dan will tell you, there's an Indigenous environmental justice network that's out there now, and you've got to pay attention to it. And then globally, Indigenous people are taking a leadership role in environmental justice, certainly in the global South, certainly in Latin America. So while it may have been true, I don't think it's true anymore. And in fact, a lot of the commitments to understanding and appreciating kind of Indigenous sources of knowledge are critical and inform how we think about the framing of the problems and framing the solutions. I mean, to take Paul's story, when I got here, one of the things I wanted to do was to meet people and walk around and find out who's doing what, and find out where the environmental insults were that are fueling the EJ movements. And one of the folks I talked to said, and so we're working on this. He said, look, instead of asking us where the problems are, why don't you ask us what we want the city to look like? Right? Why don't you ask us what we want the city to look like, and then start working on that? Right? And exactly right. Exactly right. So I'll just leave it there.
Can I just add real quickly that I just think the land back movement right now is so exciting. It's being led by an Indigenous Environmental Network and so forth, and it represents a more transformative form of compensatory justice, reestablishing control over Indigenous lands is about the redistribution, not just of land, but political economic power. And so I think there's some really exciting developments that are occurring around Indigenous environmental struggles, and they've been at the forefront. Standing Rock and Keystone, I think the Indigenous Environmental Network is really assumed an important leadership role in the movement as a whole. And Tom Goldtooth and others have just been doing an extraordinary job. So I don't think it's true anymore at all that they're taking a back seat.
Yeah, we just had a conference on land back, which I think is available online. I think it was recorded if you're interested in it. And next year, I would encourage people to attend. We're putting together a workshop and conference on co-management with Native people to talk about getting resources into the hands of Indigenous communities and looking at both the social issues and the legal impediments to getting it done. So I completely agree with you. And your point on Standing Rock, when you look at the work that's been done in Canada with First Nations and the work that's been done here with Indigenous environmental leadership, and it's about performing leadership roles in ways that are instructive to all of us in the movement. And I think you're exactly right, Daniel.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone. We're just about out of time. And what we've decided to do is to save audience questions for the end of the second panel. So if you did submit a question, we will give all 5 of the panelists an opportunity to answer it. So don't worry, we will get to questions. So I want to thank again Professor Torres, Professor Mohai, Professor Faber for joining us. And we're going to take a quick break and reconvene at 3:15. So see you all in a few minutes.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We'll jump back in here in just a sec after everyone has a chance to take their seats. Okay, let's see. That should be showing. All right, welcome back to the second session of this event on research and advocacy in the environmental justice movement, which will run until 4:15 Central Time. Unfortunately, we've had to make a slight change to the program as Sheila Foster has been under the weather and was not able to join us today, but we'll be hearing from 2 more accomplished scholars in this second hour, Julian Agyeman and David Pellow. And what we'll do then is we'll have a somewhat more extended discussion period during the second part of the session. We'll actually invite all 5 panelists to join in, and you can still direct questions to any of them at that point through the Q&A function. Our moderator for the session is Richard M. Mizell, Jr., an associate professor in the UH Department of History. His work focuses on the historical intersection between race, medicine, technology, and environmental politics in the 20th century. He is the author of Backwater Blues, The Mississippi Flood of 1927 in the African American Imagination, which came out in 2014. And he's currently working on a history of race and diabetes in the 20th century. Professor Mizell has also published numerous journal articles, and he's co-editing the Oxford Handbook of American Medical History with 2 of his UH colleagues. And he too has been involved in public history projects. And in the context of this event, I should mention in particular an exhibit he curated for the National Library of Medicine traveling exhibition program titled "This Lead is Killing Us: A History of Citizens Fighting Lead Poisoning in Their Communities." Professor Mizell.
Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me. I'm very excited to introduce our next two speakers and to be part of this conversation. And we will follow the format put forth for us the previous session, in which I will introduce each speaker, who will share some comments, and then I will go to the next following speaker. So first, we have Professor Julian Agyeman, who is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning and Fletcher Professor of Rhetoric and Debate at Tufts University. He is the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, which explores the intersecting goals of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical explorations of the complex and embedded relationships between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movement organizations, and their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, particularly in relation to notions of justice and equity. He is the author or editor of 13 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in the Unequal World, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, and Sharing Cities, a case for truly smart and sustainable cities, one of Nature's top 20 books of 2015. In 2018, he was awarded the Athena City accolade by KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. In 2021, he was invited by Boston Mayor-elect Michelle Wu to be a transition advisor on her transition committee. Professor Agyeman.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you everybody for putting on a great show, basically. I'd like to start by acknowledging that where I am here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'm on the land of the Massachusetts people and the Wampanoag people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their future as part of this meeting. So we've talked about age, and I realized it was 40 years ago this year that I was a high school geography teacher in a rural part of Northern England, very close to one of Britain's most prestigious and beautiful national parks, the Lake District National Park. This is where Wordsworth wrote a lot of his stuff. I used to take field trips, geography field trips out into the Lake District. I don't need to tell you, I was the first and only Black teacher at the school, and all the kids were white. And we would be sitting there looking at, glaciated sceneries, at, relict oak woodlands, and hikers would stop and stare at this Black teacher in front of all these white kids. And it got me thinking about how spaces are deeply racialized. I wouldn't be stared at if I was standing in Brixton or Birmingham or Leicester, but I was standing in the middle of a white space, the English Lake District. Cut to about 6 years later, we formed an organization called the Black Environment Network. We actually wanted to call it the Multicultural Environment Network, but the acronym would have been MEN, and MEN wouldn't have been suitable. So it was BEN, the Black Environment Network. During this time, we were trying to find out, because we'd heard about the environmental justice movement in the late 80s, we were trying to find out, what are our English or British EJ issues? And it doesn't play out. EJ didn't play out in the same way in the UK, largely, as I'll go on to say, because the UK doesn't have so much, let's say, policy-based or legally based segregation. Segregation in Britain largely happened through the private sector, through what are called estate agents or realtors. But I've looked at urban planning in the US, I've looked at urban planning in Britain. There's nothing in Britain's urban planning that was specifically racist, unlike the segregationist, white supremacist urban planning that we have here in the US. So I started to write letters because, again, as Paul has alluded to, this was pre-internet, and I hand wrote a letter to Professor Bob Bullard, and I got a response. He was thinking, who's this crazy black British guy who wants to talk about environmental justice? And we formed a long friendship, but it really made me start thinking about the idea of what would environmental justice or injustice look like, from a place that had a different racial and political history to the United States. In the early 90s, I was a consultant, a sustainability, environmental consultant, and something happened in 1992, 30 years ago, and that was the Great Rio Earth Summit. It had a profound effect on British local governments. Everybody wanted to know, how do we bring Rio back home? What is sustainability? Is it just a continuation of the environmental movement, or does it imply something different? And so I started this work and started to realize that all of these local governments were simply interpreting sustainability as an environmental issue. They weren't centering social justice or equity. And it got me thinking, how do we get justice into this burgeoning field of sustainability? And just let me say something. I remember when I first came to the States in '98, students said, oh, isn't that some fly-by-night, fashion, sustainability? Well, I first heard the phrase sustainable development in 1980 in the World Conservation Strategy. For 42 years, we've been debating what this term means, what should be included, what isn't included, is it intersectional, etc. It's a very robust organizing concept. And what I noticed, though, when I came to the States, was that although all of these great environmental justice victories were being won, the sustainability field was not interested in justice. I remember looking and having one of my students doing a survey of city sustainability plans that were starting to come out in the mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s. Virtually none mentioned the word justice or equity. There was, I think, a maintenance of almost the whiteness of the environmental movement into the early sustainability movement. And so we were really trying to think, how do we get the justice of environmental justice into this burgeoning new policy movement, if you like? Now, one of my first studies was of the environmental organization ACE, Alternatives for Community and Environment, which is based in Boston, still going, although Danny might have a different idea, but I don't think they're quite as strong as they used to be. But one thing I noticed with ACE that was really quite interesting was that they were beginning to think about this sustainability movement. I just want to read you the introduction, or a quote from the introduction from my book. And this is Bill Shutkin, who is one of the co-founders of ACE. He said, ACE, as an environmental justice group, has always struggled with its relationship with more traditional or mainstream environmental and sustainability groups. We played with them. Clean Buses for Boston was quite intentionally, on my part, an effort to reach out to more mainstream groups in coalition to bond with them. Frankly, we didn't need them, but we were doing similar work. The Boston Foundation stepped up, and then the Public Welfare Foundation, and everybody stepped up, because what were we doing? We were bringing together neighborhood environmental justice organizations together with mainstream environmental and sustainability organizations. ACE was, in a sense, operating within the environmental justice paradigm, but it was also beginning to think about what was its relationship with this growing movement for sustainability and sustainable development. The book was called Sustainable Communities and the Challenge of Environmental Justice. Now, at the time, the director of ACE was a guy called Pellow. In 2008, I employed him. I knew he was looking to leave ACE after 10 years. I employed him at Tufts as a professor of the practice to bring that EJ sensibility, the just sustainabilities, the community contacts into our urban planning department. And I think this tool of the professor of the practice, certainly in terms of urban planning, is a really useful tool, because you can bring people in like Penn who didn't have formal qualifications, but had fantastic, and again, Danny knows Penn well, had fantastic credentials on the street. And it has, you know, for the last 14 years, enriched our department, having a professor of the practice who was also an environmental justice advocate and director. Now, most of my work more recently, and again, this is where I think I differ with my colleagues on the panel here, I've been thinking more about how do we get justice and equity, just sustainabilities into urban planning. A quote that I used recently, my own quote, was, urban planning is the spatial toolkit of white supremacy, and we can do something about it. I've been doing a lot of research recently and looking at cities like Minneapolis. Minneapolis is one of the greenest cities in the United States. It's way up there in terms of bike commuters. Its park system is second to none. It's got a whole range of things going on, but it's also one of the most unequal cities in the United States. Green does not mean socially just, clearly. And what I found with Minneapolis, in the 1900s, it had a small but well-distributed African-American population. And then in 1910, something happened. Racist covenants started to happen. These are covenants that said basically you can't sell or rent this place to anybody other than Caucasian people. By 1930, North Minneapolis was emerging as the center of Black life in Minneapolis, precisely because of the covenants. But not just because of the covenants. In 1917, racialized zoning was outlawed, and it was replaced with single-family zoning. Minneapolis has 70% of its land surface given over to single-family zoning. So not racist, but socioeconomic calculus, which meant that basically these areas stay white. On top of that, there was redlining. The result is each of these facets of injustice were synergistic, and you have the segregated city that you have. But the Minneapolis story isn't the story only of Minneapolis. It's the story of every US city. And this notion that urban planning has been used and is used as the spatial toolkit of white supremacy, I think it now is, it's now attracting the attention of planning directors, of chief executives, of mayors, et cetera, et cetera. We've got some very good federal ideas coming up. The idea of removing freeways. We know that if you, did a GIS plot of any US city and then put the freeways on, we know where the freeways go. We know that the freeways are racist infrastructures that were deliberately put in to bust up communities. But the point is, the Reconnecting Communities initiative of Pete Buttigieg and the president, it's a good idea, but what do we replace the freeways with? If we put parks there, we will have gentrification on steroids. So we've got to be very careful in thinking about what replaces the freeways. But it got me also thinking that freeway removal is a down payment, a small down payment on reparations. 20 years ago, if you'd asked me what reparations are, I would have thought it was about cash payments. I now realize, invoking Amartya Sen, that it's about releasing human capabilities, giving people the capabilities to achieve long and happy lives. That's what I see as reparations. So it has implications across criminal justice, education, land and urban planning, etc. And so removal of freeways is part of that, increasing the capabilities of people to be able to do their work. Other work that I do in relation to urban planning and environmental justice and just sustainabilities is in relation to food, issues of food justice. Food justice, climate justice, I think these are some vibrant sub-movements. I mean, again, I think we can debate what we would characterize them as, but these have come out of the very generative field of environmental justice and now have their own momentums, such that if any of you haven't seen it, and if somebody wants to Google it right now, I was involved, as my introducer said, with Mayor Wu's transition team. What really got me involved with Mayor Wu was her food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. It starts by saying food justice is racial justice. We need to decenter whiteness from local food systems. I have looked at a lot of food action plans from around the country. Nobody comes anywhere close to what Mayor Wu's plan is. Centering racial justice and equity, not having it as some desirable second order goal after the environmental, technical, and economic imperatives have been met. So I just want to give finally a shout out to Mayor Wu. Not only is she coming up with the policies such as free bus rides, she was told it'll never happen. Now every city in Massachusetts wants free bus routes from the poorest neighborhoods to downtown. Not only is she making good policy, which can change people's behavior, but she's beginning to change the narrative. She employed a chief of economic development, but we don't call him a chief of economic development. He's the chief of economic opportunity and inclusion. We don't have an office of food access, we have an office of food justice. Change the narrative and you begin to change, I think, values, hearts and minds. So I'm going to leave it there. Looking forward to a great conversation. And thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Professor Agyeman, so much. Next, we'll move to Professor David Pellow, who is the Delson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he teaches courses on social change movements, environmental justice, human-animal conflicts, sustainability, and social inequality. His teaching and research focus on ecological justice issues in the US, and his teaching and research focuses on ecological justice issues in the United States and globally. His books include What is Critical Environmental Justice, Total Liberation, The Power and Promise of Animal Rights and the Radical Earth Movement, The Slums of Aspen, Immigrants versus the Environment in America's Eden, Resisting Global Toxics, Transnational Movements for Environmental Justice, The Silicon Valley of Dreams, Environmental Injustice, Immigrant Workers, and the High-Tech Global Economy, and Garbage Wars, The Struggle for Environmental Justice in Chicago. He has served on the boards of directors for the Community Environmental Council, the Global Action Research Center, Greenpeace USA, International Rivers, and the Fund for Santa Barbara. Professor Pellow.
Okay, thank you so much for that generous introduction, Dr. Mizell. And as you may well know, I'm a big fan of Backwater Blues. Thank you for writing that powerful book. Yeah, let me begin with a land acknowledgement. I live, work, and recreate on unceded indigenous Chumash lands, waters, and territories. And I am delighted that members of the Chumash community, particularly some of the elders, have given me the opportunity to build, or maybe I should say rebuild, relationships of trust and respect, reciprocity, and occasionally consent between their bands and my university. I was delighted to hear in the earlier round from Danny Faber. I don't think I knew this, Danny, that you were from Nashville. So I am too. And I want to dedicate my remarks to my mother, who transitioned to the spirit world last month. And one of the many great things she did before I showed up, but one of the many things she did in the early 60s in Nashville was to be a student nonviolent coordinating committee member and leader, and participated in and co-led the effort to desegregate restaurants in that city. And so I'm guessing that my parents knew your parents. So some nice history there and nice connections. So thank you for that. And so, yeah, so everything that she did really laid the groundwork for me. But let me go back to the fall of 1992. I think Julian was just talking about the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio Summit. So a few months after that, in the fall of 1992, was my first week of graduate school in Chicago. And I was in a field research methods class, and we were told, just get out into the world. The world is your oyster. The city of Chicago is an extraordinary laboratory for social scientists. Find a community to study. So I went down to DePaul University one Saturday morning where there was a conference, a mini Earth Summit, and there was an African-American woman and a white ally both presenting, and this was Cheryl Johnson, the daughter of the late great Hazel Johnson, the Black mother of the environmental movement, and Kevin Green from the Center for Neighborhood Technology. And they were both presenting about the work they were doing to advance environmental justice on Chicago's southeast side. So I walked up boldly and brashly to Cheryl Johnson and said, hey, I'm in this class up the road and I need to study you. So is that cool? And she said, we have this thing called reciprocity, young man, and so you're welcome to show up. But I have a question for you. You're planning on taking notes, field notes? Yes, ma'am. All right, good. Well, we need somebody to take minutes at our meetings. We need somebody to help us with drafting or revising grant proposals. And hell, if you're good, you can sit in on some strategy sessions. You can travel with us to conferences. And so I started doing that after, of course, I balked for a moment, realizing, oh, shit, this is a lot more work than I had thought I was signing up for. But it was a very important lesson in reciprocity. And as Paul Mohai was talking earlier about building trust and building relationships, as all the speakers have spoken about. And it was truly eye-opening for me because it revealed to me how difficult it often is for EJ groups to be heard, to get a voice at the table. I mean, I was witnessing this, right? When government agencies and industries are making decisions about these communities and about regulations that are going to increase morbidity and mortality in these communities. And as Danny was talking about from his earlier groundbreaking study, Green of Another Color, I saw it for myself, how hard it was to raise funds for these organizations and for them to sustain a healthy and functioning nonprofit group on a day-to-day basis. It was also eye-opening to see Hazel Johnson and Cheryl Johnson and their colleagues speak plainly and openly about racism when they felt that they were being disrespected or excluded. I mean, this happened on a number of occasions, and I was delighted to see grassroots community activists choose the truth over maintaining illusions and decorum. You know, one story, and some of you are probably involved with the US EPA's Common Sense Initiative, right? We were focusing on 6 different industries, trying to make them, as the mantra went, cleaner, cheaper, and smarter. Well, none of that mantra speaks to equity and justice. So folks from communities were starting to raise hell. And so we had a FACA, Federal Advisory Committee, made up of EJ groups, of white mainstream environmental groups, and labor rights groups. And we were meeting regularly in DC with the administrator, with the assistant administrator, and other US EPA staff. And I'll never forget, we had this conversation about building trust and how one of the reasons why we have an environmental justice movement is because we don't trust so many of the mainstream environmental organizations. And that really came to the fore one day when, I won't mention names, but this sister from Detroit, from an EJ group there, happened to be walking through the hall where there was a staff member, in fact, not just a staff member, the executive director of a white mainstream environmental organization, hushed tones, having a conversation with the assistant administrator of the US EPA. And we were already up in arms about this raw deal that they were trying to propose to us that would be deregulation, no equity, no justice for all 6 of these industries and these frontline communities. So we were caucusing about how to fight back. And this executive director of a mainstream group told this administrator, said, we can live with the deal that you've proposed. And so this sister from Detroit, from an EJ group, overheard this and quickly ran back into the main room, told us, all hell broke loose, and we had a heart-to-heart. Instead of calling this guy out, we called him in and we just said, look, this is what we've been dealing with for decades, if not longer, and we need to build trust, and what you're doing is blowing that up. He starts crying, everybody gets into it, and at the end of the day, we decided that no deal was better than a raw deal. And that's really, from me, my perspective, the history and the outcome of the Common Sense Initiative. But I was blessed to be invited to work with other environmental justice groups over the years, and that's been quite fulfilling, including groups like the Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego, Center for Urban Transformation in Chicago, the Santa Clara Center for Occupational Safety and Health, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition over there in San Jose. And I've continued that work. And as I said, it's been some of the most meaningful stuff I've done. In terms of, the scholarly work and how it relates to the movement, I'm sure that the EJ movement and scholarship isn't necessarily unique, but I think we're pretty unique in that so many scholars who are EJ scholars are also just active participants in this movement, sometimes leaders in this movement. And so for me, it was always understood that we were all on the same page, more or less, in terms of understanding that environmental injustice, environmental racism are real, and that we have to do everything in our power to confront that challenge. As a scholar, I always see my work as trying to analyze, but also support and amplify the work of EJ movements, but also push our thinking and our framing of the issues and the problems and potential solutions, and what I hope are new or helpful directions. And this is kind of the goal of this whole idea of critical environmental justice. So books that I've been involved with that tried to do this include like Power, Justice, and the Environment, the subtitle of which was A Critical Appraisal of the Environmental Justice Movement. And then another project I worked on was called Challenging the Chip, Labor Rights and Environmental Justice in, I think it was the high-tech global economy. Anyway, these were efforts at collaborating and bringing together leading activists who are on the front lines of EJ struggles, who either wrote chapters in these books or granted me interviews so that we could edit and publish those conversations in these books. And in each of those cases, I really saw my role as, trying to amplify and make more visible the struggle of these activists, these organizations, these networks, as they're working to transform their communities, but also to try to curate a forum for these activists to explain key concepts and ideas and to demonstrate that they were grappling with all kinds of challenges, including data collection and analysis, political polarization and gridlock and exclusion from policy making spaces, and the never-ending challenges, as I've mentioned, of fundraising in an artificially resource-constrained philanthropic community, and addressing the fact that governments and global corporations frankly exercise far more power than the rest of us on a routine basis. So yes, I consider myself a scholar activist, but I've also embraced this idea, the notion that I think the single most important thing that social movements, including and especially the environmental justice movement, can do for society is to produce ideas, to produce knowledge and freedom dreams, as Robin Kelly calls it, right? So I've always viewed movement activists as intellectuals, whether they have advanced degrees or not, because, and whether they're affiliated with academia, every activist, every social movement organization that I think is worth their salt is engaged in knowledge production and theory building. That is what they view as the fundamental contributing factors that have created the problems they seek to address. They're theorizing about that, right? As well as thinking through what the most important elements of tactics and strategies are to transform those problems into solutions. So we are all intellectuals in that sense, and no movement can survive without that important labor. So I'll just end by saying, in terms of the audiences that I've tried to reach with my scholarship, I don't think it's any different than anybody else on the panel. Ideally, I try to reach out to EJ and environmental movement activists, scholars, of course, across multiple disciplines, and occasionally policymakers. And I've certainly fallen short of much of that, certainly by comparison to my peers here. But yeah, most of my academic work is written for and read by academics, although I've done some hybrid work. The Challenging the Chip book, as I said, was a compilation of work by activists and scholars. And occasionally I've done work that's more explicitly for an activist audience. Some years ago, I collaborated with some folks on something called Protecting Your Community Against Mining Companies and Other Extractive Industries. the subtitle of which was A Guide for Community Organizers. And this thing was translated into 6 different languages and was used and continues to be used by folks who are fighting mining corporations. And so I'm pretty proud of that, and always looking for new projects to engage with. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Pellow. Appreciate that. So we have about 20-ish minutes for a question and answer. Those of you in Zoom world, again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I want to go back to a couple of the earlier questions, and I know few of you began to address this one question, but I want to ask it again in case there are other people on the panel who would like to address this. And this comes from Paul Simonello. My impression is that there seems to be a tendency to relegate environmental impacts to indigenous peoples to the backwater of environmental justice conversations. Is this true? And I would also sort of couple that with a question by Jeremy Sorgen. Where can I find information about the Land Back Conference and video Professor Torres mentioned? So any of you that would like to address that, please.
I can speak. The video for the Land Back Conference should be available at the Yale School of Environment website. I think if it's not, just reach out to me directly and I'll see if I can get a copy or get it posted on the website. Because it ought to be. It was. I thought I was basically just the traffic cop. The people who were really speaking were great. And activists outside of government, inside of government, and scholars as well. So it's well worth watching. So I'll check the website, and if it's not there, let me know.
I mean, if I could just briefly say, I think I would just lift up comments that Professor Torres made earlier about and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I heard you correctly with respect to that question about whether indigenous folks and concerns have been relegated to the backwater. I mean, I do think, as you said, I would agree with you. There is an argument for claiming that certainly was the case earlier on. But I would definitely say that these issues and as you said, Professor Torres earlier, indigenous leaders are really centering and taking up leadership. And we can see this. I mean, the Indigenous Environmental Network has been around for decades. I remember it was fall of 1992 when I met Bob Bullard at a conference that Hazel Johnson was putting on. There were 2 keynote speakers. One was Bob Bullard, and the other was Indigenous Environmental Network Executive Director Tom Goldtooth. And so even then, we saw Indigenous leadership coming to the fore. But today, we see, of course, a deep grappling with questions of settler colonialism throughout the academy and throughout many of these social movements that we're involved in: climate justice, food justice, environmental justice, and the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. And people in universities, people in the academy, people in government agencies are taking that seriously. Now that, to another question that was asked, that always raises a question and a threat of co-optation. But I would also say, and I'm certainly no expert on this, but the multidisciplinary field of Indigenous studies is really taking off in ways, Indigenous environmental studies as well, that I don't think we had seen in decades past, now with new programs and departments being founded. And so I'm pleased to see that. I don't want to be naive about that, but I think it's much stronger than it was in the past.
Yeah, no, I remember the first time I assigned I'm blanking on this other author. The decolonization is not a metaphor. That article. First time I assigned that, you could have seen students' jaws hanging open. I mean, it's like because suddenly the things that they'd taken for granted were problematized and said, I've got to, what does reparations look like in a world where you're using somebody else's land to repay you for example. Let's start talking about that. And then Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, critical works for people who, especially those students who are just getting started. So, like you can start down the right path and not have to correct it later, right? But it's challenging. It's tough because they spend the first 20 years of their lives not even asking those questions, right? But I think those are kinds of critical questions, and those come out of Indigenous leadership, both in the academy and activists. The people in First Nations in Canada are doing amazing and dramatic work and brave work that they need to be lifted up. I mean, the boreal forests in Canada, the tar sands, Native people there are struggling for their land and opposing the extraction of fossil fuels from that territory, and then opposing the pipeline. If they can't stop it from coming out of the ground, then we can oppose it getting to port, right? And it's my obligation. I don't want to put words in your mouth, to support that. Right? It's my obligation to support that.
Great.
One thing I think that's interesting, I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with an academic at University of Waterloo in Canada, and we were looking at how urban planning in the US, as distinct from, say, other settler colonial nations like Australia, Canada, and, say, New Zealand, urban planning has erased the Indigenous presence. I mean, when I think about Boston, I can walk around Boston, I can't think of anything other than the derisory sachem on the state flag of Massachusetts that says anything about indigeneity in Massachusetts. There's nothing on the streets of Boston, yet we have an African-American history trail, we have heritage trails. We in urban planning have completely erased. And then we come up with ideas, the big idea in urban planning at the moment, placemaking. It's place taking. We're taking a place. And what are we saying when we're saying, hey, placemaking? We're saying your place isn't quite good enough as it is. We're going to do something about that. So while I would agree that there is and always has been a rural and a non-urban activism amongst Indigenous peoples, we have to remember, I think it's like 60 or 70% of Native Americans are urban now. They are silenced. I don't really get the idea that there's any traction in urban planning at the moment in the US to really reconcile the Indigenous presence in American cities. We tend to think, I mean, when we were researching the paper, we started to look at, what policies have come out about Indigenous design. Indigenous design is all about design on reservations or in Indigenous rural areas. There is very little outside of, say, Canada, where the city of Vancouver is looking at some very progressive ideas with First Nations people about affordable housing and things like that. We're not doing that in the United States. Tell me a city that is really engaging with indigeneity. It's just not happening.
I like to start by saying, look at the names on the map.
Yeah.
Look at the names on the map. The names on the map, beginning on the Eastern Seaboard, going all the way across the country, are Indian names. They're Native names. Right? Dig a little bit beneath that, right? And we can start the excavation of the knowledge that we don't even have. People say Massachusetts, don't even think about it. People say Connecticut, don't even think about it, right? Well, where did that name come from? Right?
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate that. I have a bit of a methodological question. Thank you for speaking with us today. I would love to hear about how to approach research set in a country where a government does not favor the discussion of a sensitive topic, such as land dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And this comes from Nada Ishmael.
Is the question, how do you do that work, or I'm not exactly sure I understand the question. I mean, when you start talking about land back, for example, right? Like that's a real issue, right? And that means you've got to deal with put aside the scholarly or academic inquiry, right? You're grabbing that third rail, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would take it as sort of, just sort of to broaden it out a little bit. How do you write about, environmental justice issues when there's a culture of ignorance making, right? So the frustration of knowledge, right? The silencing of knowledge, sort of the unmaking of knowledge. How do you write about these particular kinds of issues in that kind of climate, whether it's in another country or in this country?
I've already talked too much, so I'm gonna let other people speak.
I mean, I'll say I don't have the magic bullet for that one, the magic formula. It's particularly, at this moment that we are in historically, where, one major national political party is openly white supremacist, openly white nationalist, and proud of being fascist. This is a moment where educators, intellectuals, community activists really have to be having difficult conversations on one hand. But I also think, for me, given the tenor of the conversations and the political polarization right now, with some folks who are just not willing to be honest, not willing to be transparent, and not willing to engage in good faith conversations, there are some conversations that I'm not willing to waste my energy on. Naomi Klein said, it's ridiculous that the Democratic Party, the minute Donald Trump was selected by the Electoral College, they said, how can we reach out to angry white men, in cornfields and heart of America, in the heartland? And she said, the real question you should be asking is, how can you better mobilize your base? The people who actually share your values, the people who understand that we have real threats and challenges, and people who are willing to be honest about that. And so that's where I am. I am trying to reach folks who are willing to have open and honest and transparent conversations. And I'm putting a pause on having conversations with folks who are not willing to do that. But I think everybody on this panel and every EJ scholar I know has worked so hard to reach out to multiple audiences. And I think that, through that work alone, through our writings, through our speaking and engagements, I know we have literally reached millions upon millions of folks. And so there are little revolutions occurring every day in those conversations. And when people read about just sustainability and take that into their workplace in a corporation, in a government agency, in a nonprofit. So there are plenty of folks out there who are willing to have these difficult conversations and listen. And I think we should focus on them at the moment.
So
I just read it. I'm sorry. I just read a really interesting book by Jonathan Metzl, and there's some other scholars looking at this about how the right wing and the discourse using white nationalism and the politics of racial division to implement neoliberal agendas, particularly in the global South, is actually doing a big number on working class whites. White life expectancy is declining. And in John Meitzel, Dying of Whiteness, he shows that everywhere where the right's been successful in implementing a neoliberal agenda by appealing to white nationalism and using racism in the Southern strategy, it's hurt whites. So this is, I think, the importance of one of the challenges confronting the EJ movement at this point is how can we build an intersectional analysis to show, neoliberalism, they're appealing to white nationalism and white status and white privilege, but it's actually working against you. And you need to come over to our side and be part of a more popular left agenda and start adopting policies that have universalistic appeal, like national healthcare systems and so forth. So I think this is one of the challenges for the left, because we're losing the white working class to the Republican Party. And to me, that's astounding that that would be happening at this moment when almost every indicator you look at, life expectancy, poverty, rates of homeownership are declining for rural white working class Americans. So I think it's one of the challenges that we face going forward.
So I actually think that's a good segue into a question about the Biden administration, which is what are the panel's expectations of the Biden administration on EJ policies or practices?
Do you mean if they control the Congress too?
Let me comment a little bit on this. I think that President Biden took a major step forward in elevating environmental justice as an issue to take on, even during the campaign. I think what was very unique in the Democratic campaign in 2019 it was that the Flint water crisis and environmental justice got mentioned often in the debates, and just about every Democratic candidate came up with an environmental justice plan, including President Biden, which his plan was called the Justice 40 Initiative. And I think he brought a lot of hope with that. And there's no question that his executive order, I believe it's 14008, is a significant executive order. And I don't know of any new environmental justice executive order between that and President Clinton's 1994 executive order. I used to tell students that that's the high water mark in federal policy. We don't have any laws on environmental justice at the national level, and we don't have any executive orders. I think that, well, I think this, in answer to this question, one of the things I don't know to what extent people in the audience or on the panel have heard about the climate and economic justice screening tool that was put out for public comment by the Council on Environmental Quality that was put out now. I think that was around February 18th. And it's caused some controversy because even though all the data show that even when you control for socioeconomic factors, race still has an independent effect on environmental disparities, they excluded race from the tool. And there's a number of, I mean, it's easy, you can easily Google the newspaper articles, Washington Post, New York Times, Reuters. A number of people were quoted about, including Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Jacoby Wilson and others, about the disappointment that the tool excludes race. I think this gets at something that personally has bothered me for a long time, and that's the long time effort to tear down affirmative action, because we haven't solved the racial disparities that all these policies, starting with slavery. We've had hundreds of years of slavery, quickly followed by Jim Crow and all sorts of forms of discrimination and segregation and redlining. These things have been brought up already. And I think a lot of people think that when the civil rights laws were passed in the 60s to outlaw a lot of this, the problems have been solved without thinking through, well, the segregated neighborhoods are still there. The underinvestment shows. So one of the things that related to this, and I'd be really interested in hearing the other panelists comment on this, is the Council on Environmental Quality said that they wanted race neutral criteria so they won't be sued. And I'm thinking, well, how can you be race neutral? Race neutral means, to me, preserving the status quo. And preserving the status quo just perpetuates the disparities. So to me, it's really putting, at best, it's putting one's head in the sand, and worse, it's really to not acknowledge the role that race has played in environmental justice or injustice or racial injustice in general. Let me just put it this way: it's a huge disappointment, and in my opinion, a huge mistake. I'd be interested in people's opinions about just the assertion that if we put racially explicit criteria, we'll be sued. You know, I don't remember ever hearing Martin Luther King being worried about being sued, or Gandhi being sued. To me, it seems like if we don't tell it like it is, it's all, to me, it's already kind of, I know, it just seems like a weak place to start, not a strong start. So I'd be interested in other people's opinions about that.
I think it is a weak place to start, but it's also, it is likely true that they will be sued. And given the makeup of the federal courts, it's likely that they'll lose. The example I would give you is the 10% plan that we put together in Texas. I mean, the 10% plan, when affirmative action is outlawed in Texas, the 10% plan, now you're down there in Houston, you could probably talk about it directly. Right. What it aimed to do was to create avenues for recognize that Texas is the third most segregated state in the country. Right. To create avenues for those communities to still have access to the leading universities, in public universities in Texas. And the amazing thing about that is the act passed when some rural Republicans realized that not a single person from their counties had ever gone to the University of Texas, right? So suddenly they realized, to your point earlier, they realized that the people in the suburbs around Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas weren't their friends. Right? They wanted to save the spots at UT for those kids, and the people in rural West Texas could go pound sand, right? And so they stood up and said, you know, hell with it, and threw in with the representatives from the 5th Ward of Houston, right? Now, those are the kind of linkages that you have to make. But I agree with you. It would be better if we could be forthright, honest, and have that discussion, because without it, you know, we're going to have to confect things that are at some fundamental level false. Right.
Could I add just one more thing? One of the articles about this, which was in New York Times, and I don't remember the person's name, but a civil rights law professor at Emory University, I was really struck by her comment that, well, the CEQ is going to get sued anyway. And think of this as, it's better to frame this as remedial work for all the government policies that have created all the disparities in the first place. And I thought she had put that really, really well. People ought to read that New York Times article. It came out on February 18th, the day that the CEQ released its tool.
I do think there's one critical point to make here, and that is the increased assault that we're seeing on people of color, the renewal of systemic racism, the attack on the environmental justice movement, the attack on the climate justice movement. $900 million a year going to 91 think tanks and research institutes devoted to climate denialism. They're all part of a larger assault on American democracy. And I'm almost done with it. We're going to come out with it very soon. And I've been doing a report on these attacks on communities of color through voter suppression and all these tactics to deny the vote to communities of color. And one could say, oh, yes, the Republican Party is behind this. It's in the interests of the party. They're appealing to white supremacy and so forth. But when you start tracing the money, when you see where is all the money coming to the legislators who are proposing this, where is all the money going to the think tanks, the policy institutes who are designing these attacks, where is the money coming from to support the American Attorney General's Associations who are sponsoring these bills, you find that it's overwhelmingly coming from the oil and gas industry. I mean, we've traced it all back. So then the question is, oh, it's in the material interests of these major corporate polluters, because the communities of color are on the front lines of the ecological crisis. They're on the front lines of the climate crisis. They're in the front lines of these battles to stop pipelines and oil infrastructure and so forth. And they have the best voting rights of any of the caucuses in the US Congress. So to put forth their agenda, it means disempowering these broad sectors of the American people. So white supremacy in this respect is really serving particular corporate interests, particularly the oil and gas industry. And the amount of money that they're putting into this. I was looking at Union Pacific. Why is Union Pacific putting so much money into voter suppression now in communities of color all over the country? And then I realized 40% of their profits are derived from the transportation of fossil fuels, particularly coal. So I think, looking at the corporate power structures that are resulting in the ecological crisis and environmental injustices, as making those connections, I think, are really, really important, because they're the forces that are attacking American democracy in general.
So we are running short on time, but I do want to pose this one final question that actually Daniel Faber asked in the chat. And maybe if you can keep it very, very succinct, which is, what do panelists consider to be the single biggest challenge confronting the EJ movement today? I think that's a really good question. And again, if you can keep it short so we can end on time, we can end with that. And apologies to all of the questions that I did not get to in the Q&A.
Well, for me, the biggest challenge to the environmental justice movement is we don't have yet policies with real teeth in them. And no one has provided any evidence that the policies, the policy statements, if you will, that have been put out at the federal level and many state governments has really made it any on the ground changes. So when I think about when we did have a kind of a revolution in environmental policy, we can all think about the 1970s with the Clean Air, Clean Water acts, the acts that dealt with hazardous waste and Superfund, and the National Environmental Policy Act itself. I believe they had an impact. They just didn't reach all the people in the same way or equally. And we have nothing yet on environmental justice at this point in time. And I think that's a big challenge.
I would say, for me, I would say one of the greatest challenges is building on the emphasis on distributional outcomes, the fact that BIPOC communities, low wealth communities, indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by environmental and climate threats, but also understanding that it is social inequality that is actually driving that in the first place, and being able to translate that, back to Danny's point, into a robust movement for a democracy. I think that's one of our greatest challenges.
I would second both of those. I mean, I think the linkage to the underlying structures of inequality that are manifest through environmental injustice, but manifest, in food insecurity, energy insecurity, start going down the list. They're all tied back to the basic structure of inequality. Now, can I make a commercial pitch? If anybody out there, I have an opening for a postdoc. So send me your resume, and I'm looking to hire an executive director for my center. So send me your resume for that too. And if you guys have any students you want to send to me, please do it.
All right, famous last words. So thank you all. I was also thinking as Dr. Pellow was speaking, there's so much sort of research now coming out on sort of the intersection between the environmental justice movement and Black Lives Matter. As Andrew was talking earlier, I sort of do work around lead poisoning, and I'm always sort of reminded how sort of Black Panther Party, for example, is not really considered an environmental justice movement, but they mobilized around lead poisoning, as did some other student organizations in the 1960s. So there's a way in which we can think about, a lot of different individuals, people, organizations as sort of contributing to this movement as well. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists. And with that, I will turn it back over to Andrew Jewett.
Thanks so much, Professor Mizell. Many thanks to you for guiding us through this session. Many thanks to our 5 panelists for joining us and sharing their wisdom, to Sheila Foster for being with us in spirit, to our earlier moderator, Josiah Rector, and to all of you who came and attended to learn more about the role of research and researchers in the environmental justice movement. Of course, we've learned many, many other things along the way as well. And finally, thanks once again to the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center for hosting the event. The Rockwell Center does great work here at the University of Houston, in part by organizing an extensive roster of events that I would encourage you to check out on the center's website. I'll just mention one talk that's coming up next week on Thursday, April 21st. Eva Kate will be at UH speaking in the Honors Commons at the MD Anderson Library. She's a distinguished professor of philosophy at Stony Brook, and her talk will ask, "Is being human sufficient for full moral status?" That's just another example of the many, many important conversations to which the Rockwell Center is contributing. So I thank you once again for attending today, and I hope to see you at Eva Kate's talk and other events in the future.